All right, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for our conversation today on AI governance from the security perspective. My name is Caitlin Fennessy. I am the Vice President and Chief Knowledge Officer at the IAPP. The IAPP, if you are not familiar with it, is a non-profit, policy-neutral professional association. We focus on building the professionals that do privacy and AI governance. And right now we are here to talk to you about AI governance because we see an incredibly urgent need for AI governance professionals. Certainly this is a new but rapidly growing space. We think at the IAPP that we will need tens of thousands of AI governance professionals in the very near term, and they don't exist yet. And so at the IAPP just over a year ago now, we launched an AI governance center staffed by about 20 experts in the field advising us. We launched an AI governance newsletter, a research program, and more recently, training and certification. We've just, in fact, certified our very first class of AI governance professionals. But because these professionals don't exist in the kind of numbers that organizations need them to ensure that AI is developed and rolled out safely and in a way that will allow it to realize its full promise, we know that we need you. We need the professionals who are in organizations already on security teams, on privacy teams, on data teams to understand and help us understand the risks and challenges and mitigation strategies. So we know that this is very much a multidisciplinary field, and so we are coming at it from each of these different perspectives and thinking through what each of these teams will bring to the dialogue. And so I'm so excited to be here today with Jonathan Damrot, who is the CEO of Cranium AI and has spent a lot of time at the intersection of AI governance and security to help us understand the security perspective here. So let me allow you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks for having me. It's nice to see everybody here. It's weird because not a lot of AI conversations this year at RSA, right? Just incredible to see how this is blossoming. We've been talking about this for a few years. So my background, we spun Cranium out last March as an AI governance and security platform. Prior to that, I was a partner at KPMG, and we were really focused on thinking about AI in the use cases for large enterprises, financial services, life sciences, CPG companies. And we were taking really sensitive data, putting it through, I had built about 16 different models and then started using some Gen AI systems and publishing them to endpoints. And it was really interesting to me because about 3.5 years ago, we started having this conversation about AI security, and I couldn't find anybody who wanted to have that conversation with me. And that was incredible. So then I started talking to peers and other professionals in the industry. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, we were taking the most sensitive data, publishing it, and we were achieving incredible things, but it really wasn't a top priority. So, I started talking to the firm and some other organizations about how could we help solve this. So I pitched the firm on the idea of Cranium and was able to secure some money to actually build a business inside one of the largest companies in the world, which was super fun. My background, I was a software entrepreneur prior to going to KPMG. I ran a company before that. I sold to a private equity firm. So it was a lot of fun to be able to build it inside the firm. And then as we spun it out last year, we came into an environment where people were like, maybe this is a thing. Maybe this should be a real thing. And maybe it's, it still wasn't really in the top 10 priority. And then last year, AI governance started to pop up, and maybe it became kind of a top 5 priority. It's amazing to see this year, it's literally in every discussion, right? Like, have you gone into a discussion that hasn't been AI this year, right? No, it's in every single discussion, right? And so this has been fascinating to watch and really exciting for me personally. I'll give you one also just little known fact, because I find I like to know people personally. So my little known fact is in high school, I was a magician. And I manufactured 3 magic tricks, and I performed every weekend, and that's how I paid for college and my first car. So that's a little known fact.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. And we will try to get to know you a little bit throughout the course of this discussion because some of what we want to do is share with you some of the data about what we are seeing in the market. IAPP does global governance surveys each year, and so I'll share some statistics as we go along, hopefully helpful to you to benchmark your approach, learning about what others do, and then I'm going to rely very heavily on Jonathan to help us add color to that in terms of what he's seeing in the market. Again, hopefully helpful to you as you benchmark, leaving you with the typical RSA disclaimer and then diving right in. And so one thing that we know, and I think you'll all have access to these slides afterwards, so I don't think any need to take pictures unless you want to, but also wanted to flag that we're going to save some time for Q&A at the end. So please do think of some questions that you might want to raise, and we will definitely devote time to it. But so last year, 2023, the IAPP surveyed over 500 professionals in more than 50 countries about their governance practices. And so that's some of the data points you see here. We learned that over 50% of companies had already deployed AI, and another 20% were planning to do so in the next 12 months. That is now basically where we are. So about 70% of companies, no surprise to you, across sectors have deployed AI. One of the challenges I think that we'll talk through is kind of understanding where that AI is within the company. But we know it's being deployed across sectors, and the risks are really shifting fast. And so I think we'll talk throughout this about some of the substantive risks we're seeing, but also some of the compliance risks that are emerging very quickly. As I'm sure you've heard repeatedly here, we have the EU AI Act about to have the final I's dotted and T's crossed by the end of this month and quickly entering into effect. So not only the substantive, the trust risks that we're quite familiar with, but also the new and emerging compliance risks, not only in the EU, but via the US executive order, emerging laws in Canada. Certainly we have China's AI governance law as well. But in addition, we know that there are huge AI governance needs emerging quite quickly. And we know that AI governance is growing as a top 5 strategic priority for companies. And so, as we surveyed our global membership, we saw significant challenges emerging, and we saw across sectors AI governance emerging. And so I want to talk to Jonathan a little bit about where he's seeing it, but I also wanted to get a sense of who, kind of where you are in this audience in terms of sectors. So if we can just do a quick kind of raise of hands. For those of you, can you raise your hand if you are in the financial services sector? Okay, quite a lot of you. How about consumer goods? Oh, interesting, smaller. Okay, life sciences. All right, so we do have a lot of financial services. How about public sector? I've seen quite a few public sector. Yeah, so great to have so many public sector folks. And then how about tech? We know we certainly have a lot of tech. All right, that is really helpful to know. And so we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive on the risks. But Jonathan, before we turn to that, I wanted to get a sense from you about where you are seeing the biggest needs emerge from the governance perspective.
Yeah, so when we think about this, it's not surprising the mix of people in here. I think from an industry perspective, we see financial services, life sciences. It sounds a little bit less CPG in this room, and then certainly on the agency side, and then state government really focused on this. I think there's a lot, we're seeing the intersection primarily because of the level of experimentation that now is getting pushed into the environment. So much AI experimentation now on the Gen AI side is starting to come through the pipeline. We see in some cases hundreds or thousands of use cases where people are trying to understand how AI can embed into almost every business process or every organizational process. And so there definitely is a need to figure out how we balance that with the guardrails that obviously, AI governance groups, which have been set up and driven together. So in some cases, we'll talk about who kind of owns that and who might or should own that, but certainly security plays a major role in trying to bring people together and understand how these, how data is going to come in, if you have kind of legacy ML systems and where those sit versus kind of Gen AI systems, and ultimately how those are going to come through the pipeline. But I think life sciences, financial services, CPG are generally like really big, targets from an industry perspective, and we see states like California, New Jersey, New York with specific executive orders, and then obviously all the agencies having to meet the obligations of the presidential EO, really racing to try to understand, like, how do I put an AI chief in place? What does AI governance mean? How do I really push this innovation that is getting pushed from the very top in every single case? We are going to be an AI first company. We are going to drive this in, without stopping that pace, but being able to really, really drive a level of governance around this that makes people comfortable and gives you the visibility you need. So that we're definitely seeing that convergence, and it's happening and it has been happening over the last few months at a pace that I just could never have imagined. Just incredible.
And I really want to flag, I think all of you in this room are so critically important because we were quite intrigued when we saw what the biggest governance challenges and needs are. They really are really basic in terms of just a level of understanding, not understanding what AI is being deployed in the company, not having general controls around that AI, not understanding the risks and benefits, and then just pinpointing very clearly a lack of knowledgeable professionals to put in these leadership positions. Couple that with concerns that you'll see here on the slides about the pace of technological and legal development in terms of the risks that are arising. So let's turn to the risks and do a little bit of a deeper conversation around those. So when we asked about the top, first, I guess, when we asked about where AI was being deployed in organizations, I don't think this will surprise you, especially looking back 12 months. Data analysis was right there at the top, and then really just speeding things up, automating processes. So that's been with us for quite some time, but that's not to say that there had been kind of all of the risks addressed even in those lanes. And so the biggest risks that organizations identified for us were around inaccuracy, IP. Certainly that is an ongoing question mark that we expect will play out in the courts. Explainability, but also very high up on that list, security and regulatory compliance. So Jonathan, here working with companies, I want to understand from you where both are you seeing the biggest use cases, and what are the key risks that people are bringing to you?
Yeah, so I think you're starting to see this in the news, right? So some of you have seen some of these challenges that maybe like Air Canada had, as an example. So you see some of this where a hallucinating chatbot defining what a refund policy should look like for an organization, and then how does that actually, is that a security challenge, right? I don't know, right? If it's basically identifying a policy. So these are some of the questions that people have. Well, how is my data being trained? If I'm moving from an environment where I was doing a lot of fine tuning and now I'm looking at more embeddings-based information, how do I even have that conversation, right? Who owns that conversation? And really, how do I think about it? So I think a lot of the challenges that people are facing today is, what does AI mean for my organization? Last year, we did a lot of work with like the ISACs and the GRF, really trying to bring people together. And it was amazing to me as we were talking to leaders in these organizations and some of the largest businesses about what does that even mean? How do you define it? We had some organizations that had 1,000 legacy models in production, right? And we had others that were building huge retrieval augmented generation capabilities so that they could really leverage AI services in a more meaningful way where they could drive retrieval and search aligned to the ways that they needed to manage their RBAC and their other pieces in their infrastructure. And so those seem very different to me, right? And there hasn't been enough AI talent in the cyber practices today, so you're starting to see people form up that. I think we're seeing like that director of AI security forming up. I think the AI governance lead, certainly in the government, this AI chief, starting to come together. And I think people are like, well, is that going to be a leadership position? Will that get budget? Will it not? And I think all of these things are hitting right now. But I think being able to define that really well today, what does AI mean in my organization? How do I drive that? And then being able to really drive an understanding of what that it looks like in the enterprise. Visibility seems to me today to be one of those principal challenges. I think people just don't understand, what's there against the definition of what AI means because they've just been going so fast. So if you have an AI team, you know this already. They're generally out there in the business, in the organization, just driving really hard. If you're just looking at this today as a consumer of AI services, it becomes an even broader challenge in the supply chain of really understanding, okay, if I'm sending my data to another party and they're using AI, that's really one of the bigger things that we're going to start to see in a lot of enterprises that just fundamentally don't have the capability to build. So that's some of the stuff that we're seeing today.
Yeah, and I love, Jonathan, this really leads really well into my next question, your raising of the chief AI officer. As we looked at that from the IAPP, we've really asked ourselves, is that model really going to stick? The way the executive order, for those of you who haven't read it, kind of scoped the role of a chief AI officer, it is both the individual responsible for driving AI kind of development, deployment, use within the relevant government agency and doing the governance. And, traditionally, governance hasn't been paired with those kind of driving forward the technology. And to some extent, I think those are unicorns, people who have both the technical and governance skills. That being said, perhaps some of you in this room will be those unicorns if you're coming from the security or the technical perspective and can add that governance knowledge and skill set. Certainly you'll be quite employable. But I did want to speak to what we're seeing so far in terms of who is leading, which teams are leading AI governance functions within organizations and who is contributing. At the IAPP, this is something we are very focused on because it seems to us that organizations have not sorted this out. So if you haven't yet, don't worry. Everyone we're talking to at the biggest companies even, they are really doing a lot of moving around of the pieces internally in terms of how they structure the governance. So let me just tell you what we're seeing so far, and certainly Jonathan, working more with security teams, might be seeing something different. But so right now, or a year ago when we did this, only about 30% of organizations had actually even established an AI governance function. They said within a year, we expected that number, or less than 30, and within a year, we expected that number to rise up to 60%. We'll soon see in this year's data whether we got there. But before I kind of dive into who's leading and who's contributing, I'd love to get a show of hands if you'll share. Of those among you, which of your organizations have established an AI governance function, whether it's a committee or a lead or the like? All right, I don't even know that we're at 30%. So that's really interesting to see, but I think that's all right. We are all kind of trying to sort through this together. There's still a lot of open questions about whether this all kind of channels up to one person or whether we have more of a stovepiped structure where each different group, whether privacy, IT, security, IP, online safety, are bringing their own skill set to bear. Let me tell you quickly what we are seeing in terms of who is leading, and then I'll turn to Jonathan. At this stage, we have seen privacy often, in just barely a majority of cases, over 50% often step up and take the lead, often with a committee structure below them. We're also seeing quite a large role for kind of legal and compliance teams, and in some cases, IT, some cases, data. But security, in over 50% of the cases, is a big player at that table. So contributing to the dialogue, even if not necessarily having the CISO as the lead. So let me turn to you.
I know we've argued this, by the way.
And it does, of course, matter who we're surveying. So give me some color on what you're seeing.
Yeah, so as this is forming up, I think that there's a lot of needs in these AI governance groups to have an operational mechanism, right? So we're probably seeing 50 to 60% of the time the CISO is driving that operational role to bring these organizations, all the leaders across, the AI function, CIO, CTO, legal, risk, privacy, together to have this discussion. And again, this data, my data is biased. Potentially, this is obviously, looking at a sampling of a lot of privacy professionals. So I think the key takeaway is having a cross-functional group is probably the most important part to being able to drive a good understanding of how this needs to look in an organization. I think the CISO is starting to look at bringing more data science. I don't know, I think everybody's trying to figure this out, but I do think having an operational role has been kind of that CISO function in many organizations. I think where it's not necessarily aligned or they don't have the talent or the budget to do that, then yes, I definitely think it's potentially someone else. I would say about 40%, 30% of the time, it's probably somebody who also has their hands in data science as either a lead or co-lead also, so that there's a good understanding, a good mechanism to really understand how those functions are getting built. And even for the people who own that, they're not really necessarily sure of all the models that are getting pulled into that. We still see a tremendous number of organizations pulling things, open source models down, putting very sensitive data into them, putting them in endpoints, using APIs directly to use LLMs and really start testing that without necessarily driving that guidance. So that cross-functional team is the only way I think that they're going to get their arms around this and put policies. And I think the next step is how do we tool this up appropriately? What are the necessary components that we need to drive that visibility? And then what are the real risks? Because I think these threats are not well understood. And so trying to tie down what is actually happening in the field, inside the business. In financial services, there were a lot of financial services. This used to be like a model risk function, right? Now model risk sits inside of part of this AI governance committee and really thinking about, okay, what does a model mean to a bank or a financial services institution? And this is getting kind of flipped because I think there was a lot of expertise on that team, but you started to see models that would not necessarily be called AI, right? And now you're trying to bring some of that together with these, really large LLM use cases to try to unlock them. And so this is where I think this is going to, this year is where it's going to come down.
Yeah. And so we're going to dig in shortly to specifically the security team and what their contribution and role, whether contributor or leader, are. But just because we're kind of starting at this overarching multidisciplinary approach, I wanted to get your sense of what the AI governance fluency to work across these teams needs to look like. And so I'll answer it really quickly from IPP's perspective. We recognize this would be far more multidisciplinary even than the field of privacy, and that the first step was building a common vocabulary, a common parlance, that a big piece of leadership of AI governance is speaking a common language across teams, allowing that cross-team collaboration, and being able to issue spot and ask the right questions to start to put in place the mitigating strategies. And so what you see here is just a quick snapshot of our AI governance professional body of knowledge that we built out and certainly publicly available with our experts to try to build that issue spotting capability. But before you dive into the security piece, I would love to get a sense from you, what is that overarching kind of knowledge base that's needed to work across teams?
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of education that has to happen here. We if the practitioners in the room, you ask any of the practitioners here, give us a sense of what are the top cyber security issues over the last decade, you probably could name all of them off the top of your head, right? Between ransomware and malware and and phishing and the things that have been really impacting and third-party security, right? The things that have been really impacting how your environment has been attacked. With AI security, I don't find the same discussion. Very difficult, right? What are some of the things on the more traditional ML side, right? Whether it be data poisoning or backdoor detection. Our head of our chief AI security officer, he came out of MITRE, right? So you may be familiar with some of the frameworks around MITRE ATT&CK. Well, there's also a framework for MITRE ATLAS, which basically details adversarial AI risks. I find when I go into organizations, very few people can really identify those and how they're relevant to the organizations in which they sit. So there's that level of education and uplift in order to have those discussions. I expect over the next 2 years, you're going to walk into a room and people are going to talk about those threats, whether it be OWASP top 10 for LLM or some of the MITRE ATLAS risks and how that starts to become very relevant. But I think we're still in that phase where people have to get more comfortable with that. They have to understand the AI systems better. They have to get deeper, and then they have to be able to articulate that in a way that allows their leadership to understand it, and then we'll be in a much better place, I think. And I think IAPP has been doing a great job of really driving that leadership there.
That's great. Oh, so I'm realizing we have an old version of the slide deck. So the only other thing that, okay. Let's turn to this then. Right now on where should security engage, where should security lead? I really think this is kind of the meat of what we wanted to focus on. I'd love to get your sense of what pieces of the pie is security really driving, and where should they be contributing that is not necessarily considered a kind of bread and butter security issue.
Yeah, well, I think the best part about what we're seeing right now is that you've kind of got securing AI. And I think this is going to continue to be part of the biggest challenge, but this is also an AI challenge itself. So, security professionals generally love to learn. This is a lifelong learning opportunity in the engagement of security professionals generally. And so we have a great opportunity not only to secure these pieces, but now use AI in the approaches that we're taking at a scale that we can't see. Like, I ran third-party security for KPMG, and I ran a company that focused on that. And what I always found interesting was we were taking approaches that were very difficult to scale, right? So you might remember we would use spreadsheet-based approaches. We send it, and then we'd expect that would somehow secure us, right? And the data would come back, and the second you got it back, it was no longer relevant to the things that were changing. AI is just changing at a pace that we need an AI-based approach to this as well. So I think that's really where there's a really interesting opportunity because we want to grow. You look at your entire development team, they want to be AI engineers. You look at your entire, practitioner team, you look at your privacy team, everybody really wants to understand how AI is going to impact this, and I think there's a huge opportunity to really leverage AI in the protection of this, and that's what we're making the biggest investment in here as well. So I would look at this as an opportunity to really understand how AI and the threats around AI are going to impact your organization, but let's use AI in how to help support that and really make it, this opportunity. We think about this, the way our framework works is, this build, attack, defend framework. So our team put some research out around that, the AI pyramid of pain, right? So as you're looking to go up that pyramid, very similar to cybersecurity, pyramid of pain, we need to think about how to let our innovation teams go, but we want to still be part of that. We don't want to stop that, but we need a mechanism to really test these AI systems against the attack piece and the red teaming, AI red teaming, which is slightly different than some of the red teaming you probably have been doing historically, and then the blue teaming so that we can really start to defend these systems and really start to use AI to help defend this at scale. And so I think when you look at how that happens over time, that's going to be a major pillar in the AI governance requirement. And so you'll see AI governance where AI security, compliance, and kind of third parties start to come together. And I think it's a major opportunity to keep learning.
That's awesome. I think one of the really critical things that we have focused on in the privacy sphere, and I want to get the parallel here, is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are so many kind of tools and templates and risk assessment based approaches that different teams across the organization, whether they be privacy, security, risk, have deployed over the years that really can be leveraged in AI governance. And so privacy impact assessments certainly are one that are being repurposed to do AI risk assessments, to do fundamental rights impact assessments, for instance, under the EU AI Act. And I know security has so many of these types of tools. Red teaming, I know we're hearing a ton more about AI-specific red teaming. So maybe let's take these in two parts. First, can you share a little bit about some of the tools that you see the security team now leveraging as they approach AI governance?
Yeah, so every organization's now an AI company, right? So as we look forward, we need to start thinking about what are those techniques? How do I think about AI? We had a large financial services organization where they had an AI co-pilot stand up inside one of their products, and 5,000 people started using it in 1 week, right? It became a standard part of the workflow. It was something that had already gone through the security process and just popped up. They didn't even have visibility into it, right? So how do we start thinking about these major challenges, and where does that come in? So I think security is going to have really, again, where I see this playing a role is having a mechanism to drive that visibility will be your first gate. How do we understand how things are changing at a pace that we never had to deal with before? We think about this both from the code perspective. So how do I look at my repos? How do I think about those things? How do I work with those AI leaders and understand how they're thinking about these things? Synthesize that with things that are happening in the network or in the cloud environment, and be able to bring that together so that at least you can tell a story of here's how I know AI is happening in my organization. Here's when I know it's changing. Here's the data set that I know is training or coming into these models. Here's how I know I'm protecting this. And so that conversation is happening now. I think when I look at both of these questions, there aren't a ton of answers, but there's a lot of these questions being answered by groups that are coming together. So we're part of this NIST AI Security Consortium, right? So how does the leaders in AI security, and some of these pieces come together to address? So there's 5 working groups, AI red teaming. We're part of AI red teaming, security and compliance. And I think again, this is where all of the AI governance pieces are starting to float.
Awesome. And do you want to do any deeper dive on how you're seeing the AI red teaming in particular be conducted?
Yeah, so some of these adversarial risks aren't necessarily a person or an organization. It's how do I think about the challenges that persist with learning systems that have to train, bless you. But how do we think about those things, and how do we make sure that we can red team appropriately? So AI red teaming is slightly different than traditional red teaming from a simulation perspective. So many of you might know if you try to AI red team some of the co-pilots that are popping up or some of the other challenges, this goes against your terms of service, right? So you basically will get shut down from a lot of the LLM services. So we are now having to come up with novel mechanisms, and these are all getting worked out now to come up with ways to simulate against either an AI bill of material or other mechanisms to start standing up and instantiating these AI systems so that they can be attacked appropriately. We can continuously attack them, and we can start to really look at what those threats are and see how we protect against them. So our AI red teaming team came out of MITRE, and they were working on a lot of government-based systems to think about some of these for different vision systems as an example. But in a corporate environment, I think we're really focused today on really Gen AI use cases or multimodal Gen AI use cases. And I think this is where there's a lot of concern about how OpenAI is coming into the environment, how Claude is happening, but we're seeing the pace of improvement in these large language models every 3 months. Last year, they were terrible at supporting code generation, right? I don't know if any of you played with it. 3 months ago, it got really good, right? So how do you integrate that? If you have AI actually helping generate code, and now you're trying to understand how that's coming into the environment, how can you red team that appropriately? We need new techniques, and that's what we're developing. Yeah.
And so I want to make sure at least those of you who are looking for what kind of frameworks to draw on as you stand up your AI governance programs internally to understand what is out there, who is using what. Again, somewhat of a biased sample in that we probably have a stronger representation from US professionals in our data set. That being said, we've broken this out by country so you can see who is using which framework where. Certainly in the US, the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, Jonathan just mentioned his work with NIST, is the most popular and certainly used around the world. There are also quite popular frameworks in Singapore, Japan, Australia that are worth taking a look at. But I think what's interesting here is that plenty of companies are also kind of building their own, likely an amalgam of these. And so it seems quite worth it to look at the different frameworks that are out there and see what you can draw from each of these. Anything to say about which of these frameworks are informing either your approach or those whom you're working with?
Yeah, I mean, I think here in the US, obviously, many of these are still voluntary, right? So we don't necessarily see legislation coming that's going to drive this at a federal level, but you've definitely seen executive orders on a statewide basis trying to understand, and push down into their technology teams and security teams driving this. I think anyone who has a global footprint is going to get impacted by the AI Act. And so we're seeing a lot of these drivers of really thinking about how do we scope our AI systems? Are we in scope? But I think ultimately it'll get scoped so that every AI system that has sensitive data going into it will ultimately be part of the scope. Today it's scoped slightly differently. So I think those are made, the NIST AI Risk Management Framework and definitely the EU AI Act are driving most of the organizations we work with today.
Yeah, and I think that focus on risk and kind of risk level in driving your program, as we know, is central to the EU AI Act and certainly what informed NIST's work. RSA always loves us to kind of leave you with some takeaways before we dive into your questions. So let me just kind of go through how we're thinking about the sequence of events here. Obviously, the first step is understanding what your organizations are using. Those inventories of AI use and deployment are a bit tougher often than you might think, even for smaller businesses. And then just figuring out who's leading, how is your governance structure set up to the extent that you have it. If you don't, thinking through who should have a seat at that table, who do you want to lead, what kind of cadence. Right now, a lot of the governance is still very ad hoc. Can you mature that into something that is more regular if it is not yet set up? And then build your fluency, as we talked about. A lack of understanding at the leadership and all the way through the organization is one of the biggest challenges organizations are facing now. And then really just raise your hand. I absolutely loved on the keynote stage this morning, Ruby Zeffo, the chief privacy officer at Uber, talked about how they stood up several years ago their AI governance program, in part just by her raising her hand and bringing together that multidisciplinary team and saying, hey, we have to focus on this now. And we weren't thinking about Gen AI then. We were thinking about all the different ways they used machine learning to build efficiency across their products. And so if you don't have this yet, and it sounds like about 60% or 70% of you don't, raise your hand and engage. And I want to flag before, again, we turn to your questions, all of the resources that the IAPP is putting out there. These are all free and publicly available at this stage, kind of cheat sheets, an AI glossary, key terms in AI governance, a lot of analysis of the EU AI Act, but also the different regulatory schemes coming around the world. I mentioned our training and certification, but start looking at this material. Sign up for our AI governance dashboard. That is a weekly free newsletter that goes out to thousands of your fellow professionals around the world each Wednesday. So with that, let me turn to your questions, and I hope you've brought some. If you could, we'll see if we need microphones, but yeah, let me please start with you.
Hi. Well, first of all, it's been a while since we have got this opportunity to have a multi-stakeholder governance. So, do you figure that with AI, will it continue to be multi-stakeholder, or should we we change more hard law advantage, where we have to force people, especially in companies, to develop new rules. But here in San Francisco, I live in Amarillo, here in San Francisco, we have wildlife all around. We have vehicles that are autonomous, and still we haven't got many incidents. Like just in this New Year, the Chinese New Year, we had massive crowds, going against the machine. Let me say it like that. It was the first attack against the machine. But I'm an attorney, so as an attorney, I'm trying to regulate. I'm trying to foresee all what's coming. All those felonies are coming through AI and with AI. So so far, what do you think? Should we change from multi-stakeholder policies, voluntary policies, wide policies, or should we enforce new regulations by hard laws? What do you think?
Yeah, maybe I'll tackle it first and then get your thoughts. I don't think we're going to have a choice as the professionals sitting within organizations from the perspective that the EU AI Act is about to enter into force. So we will soon have hard law that comes with a fine structure that is 7% of global worldwide turnover. There's some real teeth there. And then separately in the US, I'm certainly not going to bet that we're going to have a national AI governance standard anytime soon, but the states are legislating rapidly in this space, and they're doing that more sectorally rather than in terms of comprehensive state laws, although we've already seen some legislation at the state level coming in that space. So I do think there'll be, in the US, a lot of state level, more sectorally driven, problem-driven rules. Any thoughts?
I don't think we can force one person into this. I think it has to be multidisciplinary. It's interesting, Gartner did some work recently identifying what are the factors that drive AI governance. The number one factor, interestingly, was financial. So if you had financial metrics around your AI governance, you were more likely to drive AI governance and security into your program by basically having metrics and ROI tied to these programs against how you were implementing and financing them. So, I think it has to be multidisciplinary. I think that there's these organizations are so large, and AI is being developed and driven in so many parts of it. It is still very stovepipe. So I think we have to have a broad cross section. I just don't see one person who's able to do that. Yeah.
Thank you. In terms of organizations, I couldn't agree more. I think it will remain multidisciplinary. Do you have a question?
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I've been thinking, in the end, today we have AI, but yesterday you had robotic process automation. In the future, we're going to have quantum intelligence, even more biomimicry intelligence. So one could say that those are methods to handle and then manipulate data, process data. So my question is with regards to, do we need an AI governance, or do we need a better data governance that would be prone, or at least augmented, to deal with those methods of manipulation of data? And to complement, if we go for AI governance, let's say that's the way to go, for sure, I think that we should have a data governance well established. Otherwise, people will start thinking about manipulation, but you don't have the basics in place. Yeah. So I'd like to know your comments on that.
I love your question because IAPP's research team, which I work closely with, is actually about to publish some research in this area. And the way we're thinking about it is digital governance. To our mind, data sits at the very center of that. And so please, again, look out for that coming in the next month or so. And what we're looking at is how organizations are structuring and lining up their leadership and their governance for privacy, cybersecurity, AI governance, online safety, content moderation. And I don't think there's going to be one to rule all of these. I don't think AI governance personally kind of sits above them. I think what we are seeing is these kind of committee structures within organizations that tap all of these leaders and that make sure that there are neither gaps nor really inefficient duplication. And I'm going to just really quickly share an anecdote from a member of the IAPP's board of directors who said right now it really feels like we have a whole bunch of people in an operating room operating on a single patient, only they're not on the same operating team and they're not even talking to each other. So there are big gaps and kind of blind spots emerging. At the same time, there's duplication that could have really dangerous consequences. So yes to everything you said, and I think it's going to take a while for it to shake out in terms of what that actually looks like in terms of the org chart.
I would just add, I mean, look, AI is fed by data. I think people are really struggling to make sure they can get all of their organizational data in a place that it's consumable, whether it be kind of standard ML models or Gen AI systems. And so that piece doesn't even exist in a meaningful way in a lot of organizations. But I think that data governance layer into that is going to be an absolute requirement to really get the most value out of this. I think, you know, as we look at some of the mechanisms to actually make sure that when you're feeding these models that, you know, even just the standard RBAC controls that you've set up over time actually are still applied appropriately, or can you even apply things like right to be forgotten inside of an ML or an AI environment? Like, those are really challenging problems that people need to think about. And you know, we've worked with some researchers out of Amherst where just the nature of doing unlearning in those environments can create security vulnerabilities by itself, right? So how do you think about those things and where does that sit? I think what you're saying is right on, and I think it, you know, again, I know we're saying it's all happening now, but this piece has to get layered in appropriately so that you can really drive the power of AI, and we're already running out of data, right? So it's going to be really incumbent to be able to bring all of that data in an organization centrally to get the most value. But without data governance, you're going to have major insider risks. You're going to have major, you know, data loss issues that we thought we solved years ago and are going to pop back up. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is also why Congress is now kind of advancing a national privacy law, the recognition that that too is a building block to do all of these other pieces, since data is so central.
Thank you. I love your operating room example. I think that hits it, you know, hits all the buttons at the same time. So my question is, hypothetically, if I'm on the board of directors of a financial services company and I talk to my CISO, right? And I'm like, okay, I read this article. Someone told me that it's theoretically possible for somebody to extract the training data from a model. So if we're creating a model and we're putting in our data crown jewels, we're a financial services company, we're putting that data in, are you trying to tell me 6 months from now, a year from now, 10 years from now, it might be possible for someone to extract those data crown jewels? From a governance perspective, the CISO would be like, yeah. So from a data governance point of view, who should be quantifying, qualifying the risk that scenario poses?
Yeah, do you want to start on this one?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think when I talked to my leadership about this and some of the people who helped build out, you know, MITRE ATLAS is a good example. You know, really core researchers in the space will tell you how easy it is to really attack some of these systems depending on what they are, right? Like, and we're starting to see some of these persistent threats on the LLM side, and these are getting tackled and then solved and published in MITRE ATLAS or other, you know, frameworks like OWASP. So I think it is going to be a bit of a whack-a-mole, but I think that there has to be a you know, yes, I think there's going to be another wave of questions that will come from boards that will need to get addressed in a way that you can simply articulate those threats, and today that's really hard, right? Trying to get very technical and have your AI team try to explain how this works to your board, it's not going to work. So we need to come up with that lexicon that's going to be really achievable and give you what you need in order to be successful as you're going after these threats. So there's going to be a lot of money spent here. You're seeing it, right? Everything that was here at RSA this year was all about AI security and AI trust. And I think we're going to have to start really playing around, bringing these into that experimentation field as you're trying to bring those models in and make sure that you're not creating those threats in your organization. So I think yes, and yes.
Yeah, I would only add that if your board is asking that question, excellent, awesome first step. Let's take this last question.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I'm in cybersecurity and GRC. I think it's intuitive that GRC would be leading AI governance in most organizations. But my question is about, with the deprioritization of DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion in many organizations, but the adoption of AI being, you know, growing very fast, and the need for responsible AI teams, like, it's evident. Firms are setting up responsible AI teams. how well will that team function if that team itself isn't diverse, right? If the goal for the responsible AI team is to ensure that the biases aren't impacting the way the algorithms run, but simultaneously DE&I is being deprioritized, it just seems kind of.
Yeah, no, I take your point here. You know, I guess from my quick reaction to that is that I think AI and the challenges and risks that AI have raised have brought a lot of really helpful attention to this. We saw a very similar kind of path in privacy, where we understood that if you did not have diverse teams, you could not understand kind of from the user perspective how design would impact users' privacy and usability. I think we're seeing the same thing in AI governance with a focus on bias and how to mitigate that, but also disparate impact across different communities. And so I guess my hope would be that this would kind of re-elevate the need to focus on these issues. Perhaps that's the optimist in me, but I'm certainly hopeful that it will drive that focus, you know, to something that certainly isn't window dressing and is embedded in how we approach these issues.
You know, we talked about a lot of the challenges that, you know, and issues. So I'll just say, you know, I've been doing a lot of work with the state of New Jersey, right? So I sit on a couple of those committees, and as I listen to Governor Murphy and some of these conversations in the state, I would not say it has been deprioritized, at least in the conversations I've been in, but I would say there's different challenges for both from a legal perspective, as well as things like power consumption that are at absolutely the top of the minds. Like cybersecurity is definitely a challenge, but I think those issues around DEI, as well as just ESG generally, and then thinking about power in other areas, this is definitely part of the conversation. I don't know how we solve it necessarily, but I think it is going to be aligned to how they think about the legal risks here as well. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for joining us, and Jonathan, thank you for speaking. Hope you enjoy the rest of RSA.